Hello everyone, welcome to the Week 5 lecture for EMS207 2025-30 session. So today we're going to really delve deeply into some teaching and learning strategies. I do have a bit of research evidence to show you how well some of these different strategies work to help convince you. Again, in acknowledging the notion that some of you may hold views that you feel contradict the points I'm making, so I will make the case in acknowledgement of that. But before we get into those, I'll very briefly recap some of the approaches to unit design. It is week 5, so this is the point at which you're hopefully starting to think about presenting drafts to your tutorials to get extra feedback. So it's probably not a nice point to sort of think about the way you're framing that unit together as a group, so the group work can be nicely squared away, and then you can start really getting into the detail of specific teaching and learning strategies for your lesson plans for Part B. So let's get into those. So of course, just to recap, we do know a bottom-up approach is the notion that we start with either the smallest context or the simplest ideas, and we build up in complexity or scale of context as we move through. So again, you can see there that can work on a macro or micro level, so that could occur in a classroom going from simple sentence structure to more complex compound sentences. It could be through the kind of focus going local, regional, national, global. But the core principle is that the students need to know basic things before they can consider complex things. So, students need to know what a living is before they can consider its needs. It's probably a pretty reasonable thing, and it helps the students to see clear connections between the lessons and amongst the lessons as well. Amongst meaning it's not just lesson 1 to 2. Things from lesson 1 may come back in lesson 3 or 4. For example. So pretty solid idea. Many of you will probably go this route. Just make sure that you make those connections explicit in how you frame the unit outline and then in the lessons as well. So let us know what you're going with. You can of course do a top-down approach where you start with an entire scientific phenomenon or phenomena or a scenario. You say, hey, let's break this down, let's solve this problem. So top-down generally works quite well with a scenario or a challenge, like a proposal to build something in a town, and we start looking and breaking that down into its different parts, different factors to consider. The example there is, of course, the solar system, where we look at different planets within. So it's got its benefits too, perhaps a bit harder to use, but it's still a viable approach, could be worth considering. Within those, or as separate, we can have inquiry questions. These can be group 3 lessons together. It can be a focus for an entire unit. How you use them, they could be an inquiry question for each lesson. It's up to you. There are a few examples. The syllabus provides you with some as well. All I would say is be open to making adjustments, to changing them, to adding your unique context and spin to them. They're not, fixed in stone, I guess. They're worth exploring. You can, of course, have a problem-based scenario as part of this problem where students are working together to fix something. I think the example there, I use problem and project-based interchangeably, whether it's framed in a deficit way or whether it's an opportunity or a mission, up to you. But it does give a nice sense of purpose and it tends to tie things into the assessment. So it's a really great way to have that backward mapped approach, because if solving the problem links to the assessment, then the process of developing the skills to solve the problem or complete the project inherently links towards that. And again, the scale's up to you. It could be within 3 lessons, could be half the unit, could be the whole unit. Have a think about it. It's one of my favourites. And of course, it's important to acknowledge the spiral curriculum, meaning that you don't just tick it off in lesson 1 and never come back to it. You repeatedly come back to these ideas throughout the process, and the complexity changes. That's evident in the syllabus, and it can be evident in your unit as well. So it could be, what is a living thing? Differences between flora and fauna, and then eventually at some point you're comparing and contrasting flora and fauna, or slightly more difficult edge cases to categorise. But you're still bringing that prior knowledge across. We don't go, we've done plants, done, never coming back to it again. It could be that we look at Australian native versus plants from tropical areas or, the Pacific Northwest in the United States. So we can usually change the verb. That's my advice. If the verb's changing, the content points, the nouns, they can probably stay the same or be added upon. So useful to think about, particularly if you're sitting there eyeballing the person next to you in your group thinking, you've got the same lesson as me. Well, work together to think about how you can have the spiral curriculum reflected in that and use each other's lessons. So that's the recap. let's get into the instructional approaches that you might use to enact these. They're not mutually exclusive. You can have mixtures of them. Some of them overlap. It's a pretty nebulous game. Some of them you will like, some dislike. The personal preference in all of this as well. But we want to get you thinking about the different opportunities that you might engage with, and this will be part of the tutorials as well. So we have some examples of instructional approaches here. Most of these fall into the category of constructivist approaches, meaning that the students are internally, the Piaget notion, or socially, the Vygotskian notion. They're not mutually exclusive. They, of course, relate together, right? The idea that you are constructing actively constructing knowledge. The student-centered learning is often the shorthand. So we can have inquiry-based approaches to learning, solving problems, going through a process. The 5 E's naturally links with this. Most of the stuff that I've already talked about tends to lend itself to inquiry-based learning. The idea that you're not just telling them, that they're working together to discover ideas and knowledge through a scientific process or a design and production process. To this end, you can have forms of discovery approaches. This is where the students don't quite know what they're going to find out. They're acting as scientists. And the difference between guided and open is the level of scaffolding provided. So guided discovery generally has modelling, examples, group roles. The decision points that are made are more fixed. They might pick from a list of options, but it's not completely open-ended. On the opposite end of the spectrum is it's open. Figure out how you're going to do it, then go and do it. Clearly, you'd probably start with guided, then move towards more open, but it's more of a scale than a yes or no proposition. The interactive approach is more, to me, akin to, it's about the language, ultimately, with the interactive approach. So it's not to say, I'm doing stuff with my hands. It's hands-on learning. I mean, working in an assembly line could be hands-on, but it could be extremely repetitive. So we want that language aspect. So it typically is, sort of a use of questioning and language. So asking more questions and prompting and probing with the interactive approach. So it typically involves that almost interview style, using different higher order questions, what if questions, how about questions, reframing language. Usually in the explain phase, could be in other phases as well. Transmission, where you're just giving information to students. Could be video, could be you talking, could be worksheet stuff, up to you, but that is part of this as well. We have to acknowledge that. Direct instruction, it is sometimes called. There is nothing wrong with direct instruction. Think about what you're trying to achieve and how it fits in the grander scheme of lessons. Don't just sit there with one approach. You can't just go, you're doing group learning and I'm just going to sit here. You can't just say, I'm going to lecture to you. It has to be tailored to the assessment and by extension the outcomes. Modelling. This could be physical model making or you modelling certain things, like you modelling the process of writing a scientific method, for example. You modelling the process of data analysis, for example. You modelling the process of thinking as a scientifically literate person. Questioning, querying, searching for information. The conceptual change model is a good one as well. This relates to what we talked about last week, where we take students, make their concepts and understandings clear, and then they start trying to prove and disprove different ideas of the world. My favourite, traditionally, was having students try to use different models of the universe to, the moon, the sun, and the Earth, to try and work out what the model was to create the phases of the moon. There's only one that works. We'll say that. And all the others will prove to be false because they won't be able to create each phase in sequence over the course of a month. And of course, problem-based learning, which we've talked about as well. So we're going to look at some of these approaches. You can see there's actually a link to download some more stuff. So, if you want to go that scholarly approach, have the evidence, whether it's in your lesson plans or the report to come, or you just want to download them for other assessment tasks that you might do during your learning, you can go and check them out as well. There are heaps of them in the Scamp and Prestons, whether you're using the 8th, 7th or 6th edition, up to you. The library's got them there if you want to get that scholarly backing. I've got a framework that you can download here, and it is now published. So you can cite it. I'll just bring this up here. So if you go to the link at the bottom of this slide, there's a link on the notes section. You'll find an article that I wrote a couple of years ago with Professor Amy McDonald. And if you go right down to the bottom, you will find an appendix. This appendix, it's freely available through CSU. It provides clear definitions of a myriad of different approaches that I've been talking about over the week in this subject. So claim evidence reasoning cues, community projects, what constructivism looks like, debate, deep reflection, diagnostic assessment, excursions, but also joint construction is one of my favourites, which is where the process where the teacher in the expert role works collaboratively to construct a text or product with one or more students in a non-expert role. So you're working together, maybe they're getting input at certain points, but you're setting the parameters. So joint construction is a little favourite of mine. You probably automatically do it in some classrooms, to be quite honest. But it's good to be aware of the approach. Modelling, nature of science teaching, different, peer tutoring is a good one as well. Heterogeneous groups, maybe having students tutor students from younger years, all sorts of interesting opportunities there. Media engagement, secondhand research, so looking at existing data sets or websites as sources of particular Google Maps, really useful in that sense because you can look at places and do online tours. Station rotation is one that I like, where you set up different activities and have students move around them, and they maybe take notes or complete an observation or do something in the sensory way. How does this feel? What does it sound like? Etc. Etc. Very good for an explore phase. Very good indeed, because you can get that group learning and have lots of tasks happening at the same time. Teacher-led investigations are fine as well. Can be on rails or a cookbook, but these can also be combined with joint construction as well. But generally, teacher-led investigations tend to come on board because there are resource and time limitations. So again, teacher demonstrations part of that as well. Watching videos and worksheets. So this does kind of inherently acknowledge a mixture of student-centred and teacher-centred approaches as well. So have a look at this one. I think you'll find that helpful for providing definitions and scholarly references for that. I'll just move that off the screen for now. The transmission approach is just transmitting a body of knowledge to students. Okay, you need to do this. We need to know the times tables. You need to know the letters of the alphabet. You might need to tell your students the rules of the classroom, what we're trying to achieve. Like, there are certain immutable things that you're going to have to tell students. That's fine. This is not an either-or proposition. And the reason I keep emphasising that is it is sometimes presented as such, that you're either a teacher that tells students the knowledge, or you're a teacher that sits there and says, figure it out for yourselves. It's a completely false choice. It's a false dichotomy. At this point, it's usually teachers having a lot of control over the exchange of information, setting parameters, articulating choices. What week 1 of this semester looks like in EMS207 versus what week 5 might look like is what we generally think of. So generally, transmission tends to be more at the end. Telling, doing, showing, whatever you like. It's the teacher doing more stuff, the students receiving it and having less input. Okay, but we know through backward-faded scaffolding, we generally move away from this over time. Because ultimately, if the students are to meet the goals of the subject, the outcomes in the syllabus and the assessment, they've at some point got to do something. So you have to give way to that. We talked about the discovery approach, where they're often interacting with hands-on materials. As I said, it could be a station rotation. We're looking at different substances and non-Newtonian liquids and solids, or the properties of different types of feeling different things, or looking at different sounds, different instruments, those sorts of things, describing them using their own language. So really, I think quite good, in all honesty, for explore phases. But the teacher acts as a facilitator. They'd still come in and explain the activity, right? So there's still some level of transmission, of course, but the teacher's at the side asking probing questions, keeping them on track, helping them with their language, dealing with issues that might emerge. So the teacher provides the learning context, and the students begin interacting with it and describing and expressing what they're experiencing as they go through it. Walking around the school grounds, observing living and non-living things. Classic for a reason. It's in primary connections for a reason. We can do model making as well. This is a big one where we're starting to create representations of a scientific concept or principle. So it could be making a physical model in a papier-mâché sense. It could be drawing. It could be like physically acting it out, like solids, liquids and gases, having kids act like water molecules that are bound together, and then the heat happens and they vibrate, and then their little arms stop linking and they're no longer bound. They're a liquid, so they're floating around each other, and then off they go. They start zooming around the room, and now they're a gas. So how those models are made is up to you. It could be digital. Could be creative arts. So there's a lot of, this is where we start to get assessment ideas, very interesting stuff indeed. The interactive approach, as I said, involves a lot of discussion and students interacting. It's a kind of debate in a sense. It doesn't need to be structured as such, but we're taking ideas, we're challenging ideas, we're looking at evidence and doing those sorts of things. So they need to kind of create their own ideas. You might create, here are the 4 views that I think we have, which one do you agree with? So you can do some of those sorts of things. It needs to be a safe environment for students to be wrong. So there's a cultural thing to this as well. So students often work in a group, a question or problem is posed, and they work out how they might investigate it. The interaction is dynamic, so they make choices in the moment. And the control often rests with the students, and it starts to reflect how scientists work. So they might be peering and looking at what each other's groups are doing, changing their views as they move around. So the teacher generally really prioritises the discussion interaction. And I mean, in my experience, sometimes students say something that's really profound and you think, hang on, we need to stop. This person's got a great idea, let's look at it. So it's usually about language and the teacher providing kind of generative questions. So not yes or no questions, not am I right or wrong, but open questions that lead to growth. So what if we did this? How could we solve that? Not can you name this thing or how many of that thing? Open questions are the key. So again, we know that constructivism is about students actively constructing knowledge internally and physically as they move through things. The conceptual change model is very similar to the interactive approach, but perhaps more targeted. So they commit to a position and expose beliefs. I think the phase of the moon is caused by the sun blocking the moon or something, right? I think it's caused by the Earth moving in a circle. Like, there's all sorts of stuff. I mean, I did this in class and they had all sorts of beliefs. They then say, okay, this is my belief. So they then work on experiences where they test that belief out. I mean, the example I gave was, of course, moving through the phases of the moon. Because if they tried the idea that it is caused by an eclipse, something moving in front of the sun or something moving in front of the moon or whatever it may be, the shapes will not line up and the time frames won't line up. So that's the confrontation of beliefs. They will have to try and prove that what they believe is correct or disprove another. Then they have to accommodate this. And I've seen students go, I can't make this shape. I can't make this shape. And you go, yeah, well, okay, maybe your thinking isn't fully accurate here. And so they start testing it out. And that's where you get to introduce the correct idea at the end, perhaps. You can do a bit of transmission at the end, time permitting, if time requires it. You can extend the concept and go beyond. So in a sense, the conceptual change model can be a part of the 5 A's as well, where we might see an elaborate phase being the extension of the concept. So in terms of, let's say the seasons, it's a classic I've been using, the idea that the tilt of the Earth's axis alters the angle and leads to more focused sunlight, targeted sunlight, more sunlight in a relative smaller area during the summertime. We could ask the question, what would the seasons look like if that tilt was changed? If it wasn't 23.4 degrees? What if it was 50 degrees? What if it was 0 degrees? So we could ask those what if questions and they could try and find answers with torches into globes and speculate. We can do project-based learning. We've talked about this before, but it's generally hands-on, although minds-on is my preferred hands-on, minds-on kind of stuff where they're making decisions and constructing knowledge. It usually addresses real-world tasks and creates work that demonstrates core knowledge. Generally speaking, though, the teacher has a lot of work to do in kind of creating criteria, constraints, creating the parameters of the project-based learning. So what you can and can't do. So that's when I say that teachers that teach like this have a lot of prep work, but then they get to immerse themselves in the experience and it's less onerous for them. They're not talking for 2 hours, but they've done a lot of work to say, well, you can do this, you can't do this. This is a design brief. This is how your groups will work. All that sort of stuff. You can probably see a lot of the groundwork in EMS207 is done way before the semester. And then, things just kind of happen in tutorials. It's a lot more relaxed, at least for me. But it promotes creativity and it develops new processes and ideas and thoughts. Ideas may be similar over the years, but they're generating themselves. An inquiry question usually guides the project-based learning, but it could be an objective or an aim or success criteria. How you frame it is up to you, I think. And it can often have a real-life audience. So they might be pitching this to parents or the principal or you dressed up in a wig, pretending to be someone else. I mean, it's up to you. Member of Parliament, member of council. This idea of extending beyond the classroom is usually one of the best elements of this. It may not always be practical, but it's something to think about, this idea of extending into the community. Visible thinking is a nice one as well. There's some nice strategies here. So let's say a 3-2-1 bridge here, for example. It's a routine for activating prior knowledge and making connections. So it's starting to get them generating content representation. So let's say we had them watch a video about a topic. It could be the universe, right? It's expanding, it's contracting, it's whatever, it's wobbling around, there are stars and planets. But it's not explaining things to them, it's just immersing them in this, in a problem, or just getting them thinking, providing stimulus for thought. And then we ask them, okay, you've just seen this video, or I've sung you a song, or you've seen a picture, whatever it may be. What are 3 thoughts or ideas you've had about this? What are 2 questions you have? What's 1 analogy? What, similes and metaphors. This video was a bit like that sort of stuff. Once you engage in a learning experience, you might then connect those and go, okay, you've now engaged in some learning, explore phase, elaborate phase, whatever it is, 3 thoughts and ideas, 2 questions, 1 analogy. Then we come back and say, explain how your new responses connect to your initial responses. What are the changes here? What are the things that you thought were proved to be correct? Where has the development happened? Has your language changed? So the idea with this, like a TKWL chart or a KWL chart, is it is making their prior learning explicit to them in their new learning. Because I'm telling you right now, if it's not made explicit, everyone just thinks they're unchanged. I don't feel any different to how I ended uni versus how I started uni towards how I felt at home. I mean, I look different, I'm getting older, but when it's made explicit to you, when you can see that growth, it is a hugely rewarding and motivating experience, which we do know is a big part of this. Practical learning is part of it as well. Getting the hands dirty, doing fair tests, controlled experiments, field work surveys, so different forms of data collection is a big part of this, using different forms of print or multimedia, constructing models, reorganising secondhand data. So it doesn't necessarily mean getting your hands dirty, but it means getting your brain ticking along and doing stuff. Using digital technologies can be part of this as well, if it has some sort of sense of authenticity. And you can manufacture that. Teaching is a performance art. We can do investigations. Again, it is really about skill development, so designing experiments, collecting data, recording things consistently, for example, providing time for students time for thinking and discussion. So, really getting into that idea of, well, what's the answer to our question? What are the implications for this? What are the limitations of our investigation? What are we still concerned about? What questions do we, not just doing it and moving on, that time to think and talk. Clarify the purpose, methods and analysis, so really making the scientific process explicit, perhaps modelling it, perhaps doing joint construction, and to stimulate and challenge the students. Looking at different variables. Cows move softly. What we change, what we measure, what we keep the same. Once we get those sorts of frameworks in place, we can make all sorts of wacky changes, which is fun. What they cannot be is closed or prescriptive. It's not a cookbook. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, step 6, it's all fixed. It's on rails. We copy the notes. We just do exactly what the teacher says. We're not quite sure why, but we do it that way. And it is not, it's not a recipe. So as long as there's some idea of input, it could be very fixed and limited input. It could be completely open-ended, but it cannot be a cookbook. Let's now move into some cooperative learning strategies. So hopefully you've definitely got some resources for further learning if you want to go into that with some of the citations I gave you. But if we want students to work in groups, and implicit in a lot of this with project-based learning, inquiry learning, is, and even the 5 E's, is this idea of cooperative learning. It is not sufficient to say, I'll get students to work together, particularly in younger years. We want to provide structure and parameters for this. We know if you just smash people together with no structure, things might not work. You could have people doing all the work themselves, some students just not engaging at all, not getting the intended outcomes that you want if you just smush students together without any thought. And that's true at any level. So let's look at some strategies that are small, massive, little tools that you can have in your toolkit. So they scale differently. Something like a think, pair, share, where students are given time to think, then talk to their partner, and then share what they and their partner talked about to the class discussion, can be a really nice way of making sure that class discussion isn't the same 3 kids all the time, and really get them pondering. Really make sure thinking and talking are given equal time, I guess, in the process. So a good classroom management tool there as well. If we're doing cooperative learning, it doesn't just mean working together. It's not just a time-saving resource. I mean, we certainly don't do it in this subject to save us marking, because we ultimately mark your individual work more anyway. But cooperative learning implies a couple of things. That students are working to some extent in self-managed groups. Yes, you're overseeing that. Yes, you're making decisions. Yes, you can boot people. Yes, you can scrap group learning when it's not working. But they're engaging in some degree of self-management in how they operate, even at younger levels. They might be even reflecting on how they performed in that group. No, today I was bad. I was distracted. I was naughty, whatever it is. They are motivated to help each other towards a common goal. This is a tricky one. Different personalities, different motivations. But in this subject, the common goal is that unit outline. But it's a fine line. We don't want your entire individual performance attached to others, but we want to create enough motivation that working with each other is rewarding and necessary. I think we generally get that in the subject, but we can't always. Accepting individual responsibility for the group's success. The idea that I must contribute my part. Individual accountability. That we're learning both concepts and social skills. At your level, as adults, it's projecting out into the classroom. How will you function as a teacher? What's your trajectory like as an eventual leader in the profession? Do you aspire to lead in the profession? Will you mentor? Now, what are your limitations in a group setting? What are your weaknesses? What are your strengths? I mean, I found it transformative when I did this way back when, 15 years ago. I talk a lot. And my default setting is to just mow over the top of everyone. And often do a lot of the work myself. I just like doing it. It's not even a negative thing. And I learned through reflection that I had to give other people space to contribute and to talk, because that was ultimately more effective as a way to lead and move towards things. It was really transformative, because I thought, I'm a good student, I'm great, but I realised I was getting in other people's way for no reason, because I had my own space to work. Anyway, think about where you sit, and your students should be thinking about that as well. So it's learn to share new ideas to grow, and when you give an idea in a cooperative group setting, you get many back. And so you do see development. You see students learning from each other, good ideas spread, weak ideas are improved in a way that is hard to do by yourself, or harder to do by yourself. So team means everyone achieves more is the idea. And certainly with the way things work in terms of marking at Charles Sturt University, this works. And it's the same thing in general assessment at schools as well. There is no requirement when we're working towards achieving, working beyond, or whatever framework you like, where you say, I must have 5 in this category, 10 in this category. In the olden days we did, where people were competing for rank. If you help someone else, they could jump you. There is now a scenario at Charles Sturt University where I can give everyone a high distinction, if I can justify it. If I can't, I'm in trouble. I could also fail everyone, or I could give a perfect Bell's curve. Doesn't matter, because you're only competing against the standards. So the idea is, of course, in cooperative learning, students are required to do something as a team and learn something as a team. So the scale and the context need to be such that it can't be done by itself. So really, these are the core elements to effective cooperative learning, ranging from very young students. Obviously, with younger students, it's more isolated, more structured. As you get older, it becomes more extended, of course. So the scale changes and you respond to need, you move groups around if necessary. But you need this sense of positive interdependence, that the group sinks or swims together, that we are a team. I'm not going to go into sports analogies. Insert your own there. I'm sure you can come up with one. That there is individual accountability. Each of us must contribute to learn. Could be through jigsaw methods, for example. That we need interpersonal skills. Again, you might be able to talk, but you can't listen. You need communication skills, and these are a two-way street. Yes, I talk a lot, but I try to give other people space to talk as well. They don't always want to talk as much as me. It's probably not humanly possible in most cases. We want trust, we want leadership, we want decision-making, and we want reasonable conflict resolution. We want a process whereby conflict is seen as a normal part of this, and it does not evolve, or devolve, I should say, into personal conflict all the time. That we can receive negative or differing information and still function. Huge developmental stuff there. Huge. I really believe in it. Face-to-face promoting interaction, meaning when we're together, we're not always agreeing, but our interactions are promotive. They are leading towards a better result. I always used to say, and I still say this to this day, I don't have to be right all the time. If you don't like the way something is being done, and you can give me a better idea, we'll do it. But what I cannot abide, and what we won't accept in this subject, and you shouldn't accept in your groups, is someone going, I don't like that, end of discussion. If you don't like something, you've got to have a better idea, or you've got to shut your gob. Processing, reflecting on how the group is functioning and how to function even better. And we've been doing this over the course of the semester as well. And hopefully you can take some of those skills in a more micro sense and have them working in your cooperative learning as well. You don't have to do cooperative learning for every lesson. It's pretty demanding, but you can have little bits of pair work, informal group work and stuff like this. So they facilitate a deeper level of understanding, generally speaking. They are they're absolutely vital to STEM learning. The evidence base is just cut and dry on this. It also facilitates inclusive learning, because when you have heterogeneous groups, the students performing at lower levels benefit from it, and high-level learners tend to do well anyway. So there's literally no downside to it. One does not drag down the other. It is not a zero-sum game. And it provides the use of reasoning and problem-solving skills. Justification. People operating at a sophisticated level, the high-performing students learn how to explain things to students that are not performing at the higher level, what information is key. They learn to prioritise key ideas, know when to cut the cord and go, no, this is not necessary detail. It's not easy. Kids take years to develop this, but it's worth starting down this trajectory. And it provides a supportive and fertile environment for creative tasks. You build trust over a period of time where you can be wrong. So again, we need these elements, which we just talked about. So let's go into some strategies that we have here. So we have, I will go through these look, there's stacks of them, okay? We're just trying to get you started with a couple of key ones that you might use at different times. You don't have to. But it's, building that repertoire. The one we see in basically every assignment is this one, think, pair, share. So, you have a class discussion, you have a quick key question we're thinking about. Could be in that engage phase. Could be in any phase, really. It's such a useful tool. Have a think about the question. Now, in younger levels, you might say, we need to be quiet and thinking about this for 30 seconds. Count with me. With older students, you could just imply the whole thing's going to work, right? Judge your audience. I'm not going to patronise adults, but younger students might need the structure, if they're not familiar with it, to understand what this is. You pair with your partner, so you get a chance to have a bit of a yap with the person next to you, because people like to talk. They build relationships this way, right? You pair with your partner and you share your ideas together, and then you can report back to the class. So when it's reporting back to the class, this is the active listening component. It is not, I thought, it is my partner and I were thinking. So it's developing listening and speaking skills. It's quite useful and low pressure, because you're just talking to the person next to you, or to a little group of three. So it's a nice way to start this. So have a think about this one, because I think you'll find it has a role in class discussions. You might break it out on your next prac when you've just got the same kids yelling over the top of everyone. Yeah, the first time you do it's going to take a little while, but it could be a nice way to sort of establish the culture you're looking for. Another one, perhaps for diagnostic assessment, or to create artifacts that can be used at any form of assessment, is the 3-step interview. Very easy idea. That you have person A, B, and C. Person A is interviewing person B, and person C is recording, and then we swap roles. So we could be writing notes, we could be doing an audio recording. I don't know. It could be a role-playing exercise. We used to do it for people's preparation for their interviews, their accreditation interviews, before they went out. So we had people modelling those processes in higher education. So the roles can be rotated and specified. You have printouts, laminates, those sorts of things. One that I do like is a roundtable discussion. Again, not as confronting as talking to the whole class, speaking in front of everyone, where everyone gets a chance to speak about a topic. So we have a key topic, and person one gets 20 seconds, next person gets 20 seconds, and it is uninterrupted. It stops people like me that want to talk over the top of everyone, and it stops people that just want to sit there in silence. Everyone has to say their piece. This can be verbal. You talk for 20 seconds, you talk for 20 seconds, you talk for 20 seconds, and someone's taking notes. Fantastic. It could be non-verbal, where people pass something around and write their piece. It can be a cascading roundtable, where people don't repeat each other. They say, well, I agree with that person, I have one thing to add. And the last person says, I agree with what everyone said, no further notes. So cascading means we're not repeating, we're just adding information as necessary. So me at the end goes, everyone's covered it. I agree with what we've said. So there's lots of different ways to go about this. There's no best way. It's up to you in the classroom. Numbered heads together is one of my little favourites. I've used it for games-based stuff like quizzes and things, for a bit of fun. It's a 4-step process. So the teacher has students numbered off within groups. So each group has a number 1, 2, and 3, 4. there's a lot of remember those little sports games? You play that little hockey game with newspaper rolls? God, it might not happen anymore. And they go, number ones, and you go out and chase each other around with bits of rolled up newspaper and a tennis ball. But it's like that. There's a 1, 2, 3, and 4 in each group. And the teacher asks a question. So it could be a little form of formative assessment, a little quiz at the end. The teacher asks a question, and then the team, the 1, 2, and 3, and 4, 5 or 6, whatever it is, they all get together and they go, what's the answer? They talk it through with each other. Someone goes, I know it, let me explain it. They do it as a team, and the teacher says, okay, I need the number 2 to explain. So the idea here is everyone needs to understand the answer, because you can't just rely on one person to go, I know it. So they have that period to actually share together and get the points. I mean, I usually do points, do it like a game show type thing. We can do a pairs check. Don't see it as often. So they solve like they might be solving competing mathematics problems, for example, and then they swap and check each other's answers. I mean, I've done it with students creating their own quizzes and stuff. Like, it's pretty interesting. But essentially, one pair works on a problem, and another pair checks the problem. The source of the problem could be could be stuff you found on the internet, could be stuff that the students create themselves. I used to like getting them to create their own quizzes, although they'd make them really hard, and I had to make sure they were right. That was tricky. Jigsaw is one we see a lot as well. So is a cooperative structure in which all members of the cooperative group become experts in different aspects of a topical study, an area of topical study. So, we might say, for example, we've got a group that's studying the universe, and person 1 is doing one planet, person 2 is doing the next planet, so on and so forth. So essentially, everyone is becoming, in a group, is becoming a master at one topic. We can see this in EMS207, where everyone is becoming responsible for sets of 3 lessons. You might have jigsawed the syllabus document. Someone went off and did creative arts, someone went and looked at English, someone looked at mathematics, and you all came back and started giving advice on those connections. The other option, jigsaw, so everyone becomes an expert and you need each other. Jigsaw 2, where those divides are not within the group members, but between the groups. So group 1 is an expert on this thing, group 2 is an expert on this thing, group 3 is an expert on this thing, group 4 is an expert on this thing. So group 1 is doing living world, group 2 is doing material world. You get the picture, all different stage levels. We can also see this in its own way reflected in EMS207. And this is really neat, because if everyone becomes experts on a historic event or a different form of natural disaster, that's a good one. There's a lot of interesting stuff on that. So there's a group that's become expert on tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanoes, bushfires, whatever you like. And then we go, okay, there's a 1, 2, and 3 in every group. All the 1s regroup on table 1, all the 2s over here, 3s over here, 4s over here, and suddenly there's someone who should have knowledge or a printout or whatever they've created on each topic, and they can start swapping and sharing information. Really interesting. Interest complex, could occur over multiple lessons, could be abandoned. We don't know. It could be a dud. You might not have the class for it. That's the other thing. In all of this, I do want to reiterate. You might not have the class for this. You might be a casual teacher. You don't know the class. There are behaviour issues. You don't have the trust. And so you start off with simple stuff. But this is where you can move to if the circumstances allow for it. Roll cards. I think most of you will probably use roll cards, and rightly so. Basically, these are where students are given very specific roles in the group functioning, usually in a form of investigation. It could work in explore or elaborate phase, for example. But the common roles we typically see are a facilitator, so someone who's essentially acting like a mini version of the tutor. Go, okay, let's move on to the next topic. They're almost like the chairman of the board. Someone who's recording, so maybe writing notes, filling out the worksheet, writing down the steps, taking notes in the group, the round table discussion. You've got a reporter. And that person, when the teacher asks, what is your group up to? That person gets up and talks. You can have a timekeeper, materials manager. So when you say go and get your stuff, one person goes and does it. And a checker to make sure people are on task. My advice, start them off, explain them, get them to change their roles. Because people will just gravitate towards the roles they're comfortable with if left alone. So this is a good one. You can create laminates. Obviously, as they become familiar with it, they can rotate through them fairly easily. Lots of things here. You can do station rotations, structured debates, different frameworks, predictives of explain, cows move softly, what we're going to change, measure and keep the same, claim evidence reasoning. What's my claim? What's the evidence I have for this claim? And how do they link together? The reasoning's a big thing here. It's not just saying, here, they're not like Pokemon cards. This is my evidence. and we don't do anything with it. We have to rationalise it. Metacognitive approaches, so reflecting on their own journey. I remember a student basically saying to me when we were reflecting on his work when he was a Year 6 student, I think he actually might have been Year 5 at the time, and he said he had a tendency to take the easiest work possible. And he knew he was lazy. He'd just take the easiest work possible and do lots of it. And he just admitted that to me off the bat. And I had to say, is this the best work you're capable of doing? That was my question. And that's what he told me. Brilliant self-reflection. Brilliant. For an 11-year-old. Brilliant. And we started talking about when you might do that. This week I'm tired, I've been on a holiday, I'm not quite up to it, I'm going to go a bit easier this week and go harder next week. Really brilliant stuff. Excursions and outdoor science, that can be part of this too. You can have a special guest. But if you use a special guest, prepare for it and then do something with it afterwards. Don't just have it as a guest lecture and nothing happens. And of course, joint and guided construction with scaffolding. Many others. Lots of them here, fishbowl strategy, circle of voices, rotating trios. Lots of stuff you can check out there. I don't want to bore you to tears with all of that because I've been talking again for quite some time here for 40 odd minutes. But there is a question that remains here. Hopefully you've got a bit of a sense of some things you could or couldn't use. You've got some things to walk away with in terms of resources here as well that you can download from this PowerPoint. But there's a pretty clear question here, key question, which is, does this stuff actually work? Now, you might be sitting there thinking, oh, God, look, I've heard about this group learning stuff, and in the media they say it doesn't really work, and direct instruction is the big thing that everyone's talking about in the media, and this just sounds like nonsense. And, be careful with the media, because they're often trying to create this divide between teacher-centred and student-centred. Really, as we say, it depends on what's trying to be achieved. So it has to be student-centred if they're creating stuff, right? We can't just talk at them the whole time. And ultimately, a school system that is just rote learning and doing the multiple choice quiz all the time is preparing students to do what? Do tests, not ecologically valid assessment. So when we do ecologically valid work, it is skill development knowledge that is relevant to the society those students are entering. Okay? So I did a scoping review of these practices a couple of years ago with some colleagues. So we went and found, I can't remember how many articles, you're in there somewhere, a couple of hundred, maybe 240, 260, no, it wasn't 260, it was over 100. Sorry, I've done a lot of them. And we looked at articles that had used different approaches. Researchers had used different approaches, cooperative learning, different things, and they had compared these approaches in a pre and post setting, so how much growth students had shown on different measures like skills, attitudes, and achievement. And sometimes they compared those to traditional, like transmissional textbook approaches. So we were able to sort of get the corpus of evidence out, research from all these different countries. And this is what we found. Yeah, you can download it if you want to. It's there. It's freely accessible. Could be worth citing in your second assessment primarily, because it does justify a lot of these approaches. So these are the things we saw in scholarly literature for 20 years. With regard to STEM education primarily. Well, it's actually primary science in this article. But we saw lots of inquiry and project and problem-based learning. Lots of technology integration, lots of cooperative learning, site-based or community-linked learning, literacy dialogue as well, cross-curricular integration, so sort of your more STEM-based stuff. We're obviously looking at primary science, hands-on student-centred, broadly defined, things like play, lessons, stations, alternative conception stuff, the 5 E's. So quite a lot of the things we're talking about are represented in this scholarly literature base that we looked at. And this is what we found. So there are 3 lines here on this page. So on the left hand, the y-axis, the left-hand side over here, we have an effect size. An effect size is a measure pre to post of change over time. Could be in anything. But in this case, it's usually academic achievement. You do a pre-test, you get scored 2 out of 15. On the post-test, you score 15 out of 15. All of these research projects in this were different. They used different approaches. They were doing different forms of assessment. They were occurring in different countries. But because we've been able to, in this project, calculate effect sizes based on the statistics provided in each article, we could determine the levels of growth. At the top here is a 2.0 effect size gain. This is key. A 2.0 effect size gain is astronomical in learning. What this would mean in practice is that the 98% of the students on the post occasion of testing would be scoring above the mean of the pre-occasion, which is astounding. This means that all your students, regardless of need, are basically going above the average on the pre-test. Huge, considering the diversity of learners. It is associated typically, a 2.0 effect size is associated with small group or one-to-one learning. So this is in education called the 2 sigma problem. How do we get as close as possible to one-to-one tutoring in a typical classroom setting with these strategies that we might have? If you go to things like NISA, above average growth on a year basis would be 0.5. Moderate growth, 0.5 effect size. Significant growth would be 0.2. What we can see here, these blue bars, are what was reported in the academic literature. So the average across these was actually over 2. So the average cooperative learning, student-centered strategy, whatever it was essentially, in terms of academic achievement, approximating one-to-one learning. And no one's doing that. You're not getting one teacher for every student. It's crazy. Huge gains. And similarly strong gains for skill development, which is not as well developed in literature, and attitude change. Like these are large growth effect sizes. Like a 0.2 effect size is kind of might be the difference between looking at the physical stature of year 8 and 9 students. Like, yeah, it's there, but if you mix them together, it's going to be pretty hard. The 0.5, so the moderate effect size growth, is going to be like observing the difference between year 8s and year 10s. It's going to be pretty obvious, right? You're going to see beards, broken voices and that sort of stuff in the boys, and you're going to get a bit of squeakiness in the year 8s, but it's there. You can just visually see it straight off the bat. When you start getting into 1 effect size or above, it's like looking at an NBA team and a group of average 12-year-olds. The difference is going to be just very, very obvious. It's almost like grade school T-ball and New York Yankees in terms of size once you get up to 2. Huge differences practically. And they also did the comparison with traditional approaches. So we do know that traditional approaches can do some stuff. Like if you sit there with a textbook, you're going to learn some stuff. But we can still see large effect sizes in comparison to the growth recorded with traditional approaches. So these are measures of comparison between 2 groups on post-test occasions. One group's done the textbook, one group's done inquiry learning, for example. And so we're still seeing 0.7, 0.7, 0.8. So large effect size gains relative to the traditional approaches. So it is still very much worthwhile. So not only will you get large growth pre to post test, you'll get better outcomes compared to traditional approaches on the post test. Just it floored me when I came across it. If you want to learn more, without going to academic article, I wrote a blog last year for the AARE about some of these ideas. I won't bore you with that right now, but it's written just in I guess, easier terms, I would say. It summarises the main points if you want to take a look. But what does all of this mean for you? You need to start thinking about what activities you might incorporate in your lesson plans for Assessment 1 Part B. So a few things to think about, and this will be reflected in the activities this week in tutorials as well. What are the 5 E's phases in your lessons? Because which 5 E's of the 5 E's phases you're doing will dictate the strategies that you incorporate. So reflect on previous weeks, the previous brainstorms and 5 E's, what the structure of a unit looks like, what sorts of teaching approaches would you be using for this? There are so many that have been articulated here. You have just a smorgasbord of things to incorporate just from this subject, but there are more out there. Will there be an inquiry question that is framing your learning? Do you have bottom-up or top-down? What instructional approaches have grabbed you here? Are you thinking, think, pair, shares, easy money, let's go with that? Or are you thinking, actually, I'd like a debate. Or I've got inquiry, I've got guided discovery research projects I want them to do. Hopefully something I've said here today, at least a couple of them spoke to you and you thought, I can see this in my lessons. And you're all going to do different things, which I'm looking forward to. Will you embed any cooperative learning strategies? I would recommend yes, it is in the rubric. So I'm hoping everyone that's listened to this is probably at least going to do think, pair, share. But there are more out there and they vary in scale. It could just be part of one discussion, could be a whole lesson. Play around with them. For the lesson plans, show me your repertoire. Show me a variety of things. Yes, in practice, you might go with consistency and structure, but the whole point of the lesson plan is to show us your breadth of ideas, your repertoire that you could deploy. Okay? So please bring a draft for this week of your group component. We're going to do some feedback. It does not need to be complete. It can have gigantic question marks. It can be written in dot points. It could be fully finished. There are no marks on the table for this. So you can show up to this class and not have anything. You can have some vague points. Don't waste the opportunity though, because you are going to likely have your marker or the person responsible for your marks sitting in front of it, your assessment, talking to you about it. And in Bathurst, if you miss out, tough. I'm not answering emails afterwards. This is the opportunity. Okay, come to class. We're going to do feedback sheets on this. We'll talk about the arrangement. You might even have questions and say, oh, look, we're not sure about lessons 9 and 10. We've got no ideas. Can you help us? There are no marks. There's no, you're not going to be penalised in any way if you show up and you've got a few dot points. It's not about that. Some people have lots of stuff. Some people have a little bit. But please bring something. And the reason we say bring something is because every fail we've come across is usually a surprise. So if we see you up there, you're not going to be a surprise, we hope. And each group will be given some time to verbally present with a copy on the screen with them. And then the groups and the tutor will give feedback simultaneously. Ideas, suggestions, those sorts of things they're not sure about, things they like. And this can be helpful because you might find that there's a certain element that you thought was a throw-in that is actually really well received by the tutor and your classmates. And you think, well, let's make this maybe cooperative learning a big aspect, or this community engagement a big aspect. It will help you prioritise in the coming weeks. So do engage with this. In terms of the preparation, for the coming week, week 5, we're starting to move into, you can see module 3. If the lecture is not for you, go into the modules. Of course, what your group is working on and your tutor is requesting remain the priorities, and listen to me as the third option here. But again, complete this lecture activity. This really is the brainstorming of teaching strategies that you might incorporate and that draft of the unit outline. For formative feedback. That's the real key component for week 5 tutorials. But on that note, I will end the recording, and I guess I'll see you in the next recording, hopefully.